welcome back for this final lecture. It's basically going to focus a lot on the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, again, kind of tracing their developments in the Cold War policy making. But what I hope to accentuate or highlight is that how the policies didn't necessarily correlate to uh, the needs and the need for attention on third world and developing countries that were becoming newly independent, and how they themselves were beginning to take matters into their own hands to try and um, seek greater economic empowerment for themselves. And in many respects, this pursuit of identity in their own right is going to have pretty significant repercussions on Cold War superpowers. And it kind of gets us back to what we were talking about and harping on at the early stages of the semester, talking about identity. How identity itself can be very uh, malleable as far as and resilient as far as being affected by outside forces and also internal forces, but then how it can, uh, in many respects, because it is so resilient, it can, in unexpected ways, affect um, powers that are, on paper, seem to be much more, you know, advantageous or more predominant as far as just the projection of force or influence. But if an identity is resilient enough, and you know there is that kind of ability to maintain it, and I think time and again people are able to do just that in the face of overwhelming odds against particular populations, or you know efforts to exterminate populations or to subjugate them. Uh, what One of the themes that's drawn from this entire kind of series of lectures, but also the historical record, is that time and again identity seems to be retained to a large degree. Okay? And so, if it is not paid attention to by others, such as we'll see in the case of Vietnam, this can have dire consequences by misunderstanding and misrepresenting the entire focus of what the particular uh, circumstance is even about. Okay, I know that seems a little abstract. We'll get into the details here, um, but I want to start off by talking about Eisenhower and Kennedy. That these were two Cold War hardliners, and they came into power. They were elected into office in the midst of the Soviets' call for more of a peaceful coexistence, with Khrushchev succeeding Stalin in 1953 and consolidating control within Russia by 1956. So, on the one hand, there is an effort to try and ease the tensions, the Cold War tensions that had existed in the previous years, as we discussed in the earlier segments. Uh, Nikita Khrushchev himself, in 1956, once he felt confident enough to begin to, kind of lead had consolidated his own position within the proletariat, or Politburo, I should say, and he even went so far as to begin to condemn some of Stalin's practices, which would have been unthought of or unthinkable when Stalin was still alive and in power. Both the United States and the USSR begin to turn attention toward influencing third world nations. Now, the term third world is kind of antiquated. Um, the developing world is another term that's often substituted for that label. That in itself is also kind of an outdated term. But we're talking about these newly independent countries that are beginning to emerge after 1945, and from the yoke, basically, of the colonial mantle. Page 722 of your textbook does a really nice job of showing you the areas of the world that we're talking about. The majority of the African continent, the Middle East, and also, as mentioned earlier, with the Southeastern Asia, India, the Indian subcontinent, and so on. So it gives you an idea as to the vast numbers of people, the geographic swath that we're talking about here. These newly independent countries after World War II were of course ex-colonies of the European empires. They were small, relatively small, non-nuclear nations. I mean, India is a subcontinent unto itself, so that's an outlier or an exception. Um, they were often non-industrial or pre-industrial states, so they were had highly labor-intensive economies, and they looked to embrace industrialization as quickly as possible in order to again advance their own station and the standard of living of their own populations. Both presidents, Eisenhower and Kennedy, had differing views on how exactly to handle security issues facing the globe during their respective administrations. Neither view was particularly successful. The strategies themselves, Cold War oriented as they were often too rigid to be highly effective. To begin with, Eisenhower's security strategy, he called for what was deemed a new look. This was bent on the idea of reducing the size of the U.S. conventional forces while building up the nation's nuclear stockpile. So therefore, the size of the Army and the Navy were cut by at least 1/3. Meanwhile, attention focused on building up the U.S. Air Force, which was the delivery mechanism for the nuclear arsenal. Stockpiles of nuclear weapons rose from about 1,200 weapons to over 22,000 in Eisenhower's 8 years as president. The emphasis here was put on terms like massive retaliation to basically keep the peace and international security by threatening mutually assured destruction. What this really failed to accommodate for was, or anticipate, was the small regional conflicts that were going to emerge and spread or emerge, pop up all across these new areas that were again becoming independent, and how these newly independent states would conflict in some cases with one another, and also they would begin to conflict with the established spheres of influence that had been, kind of ad hoc, kind of been just established early in the Cold War. For a couple examples, or to give a couple examples here, in the Middle East in 1953 in Iran, you have Mohammad Mossadegh, a leftist leader, coming to power, and he's popularly elected. He was one of these states that did not have a large industrial base. What Iran had was a healthy reserve of petroleum. And so therefore, he looked to take this one asset, national asset, and nationalize the entire industry, Iran's entire oil industry, meaning that it would become state-run. The revenue that was generated from the sale of this resource, this commodity, would go into the treasury, the public treasury, and could support public funds of programs needed for the Iranian people. The infrastructure that had been set up, the oil refineries, the oil pumping stations, they had all been created during and established and built and owned by British companies and British interests, because this was originally kind of a colonial possession of Great Britain. When Mossadegh announces that he's going to nationalize this industry, then that meant that these British interests were going to obviously lose out, which they didn't want to do. The United States and its Central Intelligence Agency backed a successful effort to overthrow Mossadegh and replaced him with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi back in, and put the Shah back in power. In return, the Shah would provide the United States with 40% of Iran's oil revenue, which is exactly this vital resource would be necessary for essentially fueling the military-industrial complex of the superpower itself. It would keep prices low as far as oil refined products, and that's the security arrangement that the United States made with the Shah of Iran. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Egypt sought again, much like Mohammad Mossadegh had tried to do, Egypt sought to seize control of the Suez Canal. The canal had been originally built and completed in 1869. It was built by the French and the British, and it basically linked the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, so that ships no longer had to traverse and circumnavigate all the way around the African continent. They could essentially bypass it. This cut weeks off of the amount of shipping, the shipping time required to get goods from India in particular to Western Europe and to British ports specifically. That arrangement lasted here until 1956. Egypt, again, an independent country, it had been independent since the early 20th century, was looking to enhance its ability to generate revenue for itself, seek economic independence. One of the best ways to do that, again, was to take infrastructure and use infrastructure such as the Suez Canal and the tolls that were generated from it. So ships would they would pay tolls in order to access the canal and use it to speed their passage to and from market. The monies that had been collected since the canal was brought online went to again French and British owners of the canal, and so here Egypt is going to try to take those funds and redirect them and keep them within the Egyptian state. So Egypt had become an independent country, but the canal remained a colonial possession, and a European possession. Egypt seized control of the canal. They nationalized it again. And this heightened European fears that Egypt would manipulate, particularly and specifically, oil supplies that were used to help fuel and heat Western European countries. Europe, in response, cut aid to Egypt, who was led at the time by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the prime minister, and later president of Egypt. And in return, to make up for the lost support from Western European powers, Egypt instead accepted aid from the Soviets. Not happy with that arrangement, France, Britain, and Israel concluded a secret pact in which they would coordinate resources and manpower to take the canal by force. They attacked Egypt in a surprise lightning strike, and very quickly the gains were very rapid as far as the ability of the Israelis, the French, and British forces to kind of seize the Sinai Peninsula, but also key points of the canal and its operation. However, Nasser was able to block the canal. He was able to appeal to the United Nations and to global public opinion to put pressure on these three belligerents to force a withdrawal. And that's exactly what happened. The UN condemned this surprise invasion. It forced the British and its allies to withdraw and retreat. And even an embarrassed United States, a Cold War ally, of course, to Britain and France, was put in a position where they had to reprimand their own allies on the floor of the United Nations itself. So it's pitting. This example is really pitting the United States against its own allies. Now, the Soviets could have really benefited from that. They could have scored a lot of points as far as international public opinion was concerned. However, it just so happened that in that exact year, in 1956, and almost coinciding, in many cases it was coinciding with the unfolding of events in the Suez Crisis, the Soviets had their own problems within the Warsaw Pact, the sphere of influence that the Soviet Union had established for itself in Eastern Europe. And this gets us into what's known as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Now, it should be noted that Premier Khrushchev, had and was focused on easing tensions with the United States. He also wanted to ease control over countries in Eastern Europe, and in fact, he wanted to put a friendlier face on Soviet foreign relations, when it specifically with regard to these emerging countries in places like Africa and the post-colonial parts of the world. Hungary decided to test the limits of Khrushchev's call for peaceful coexistence and kind of this greater sense of autonomy. So they sought to create for themselves, the Hungarians sought to create for themselves a new, more independent communist regime that eventually and very quickly took control of the central bureaucracy in Hungary. They wanted to break away from the Soviet alliance, from the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviets did not and could not allow Hungary to go that far and be that kind of autonomous in its international affairs, in its plot an independent course for itself in that regard. So they moved to crush this new government, and that's exactly what happened. That Soviet tanks moved in um, and managed to put down the rebellion and bring Hungary, install hardliners that brought Hungary back into the sphere of influence of the Soviet orbit. The U.S. Demanded Hungarian independence, but they weren't really prepared to act on it. Why? Well, because at the same time they were having to deal with their own, um, you know, renegade activities brought about by the Suez Crisis and keeping Britain and France in line, and also to a limited degree Israel as well. So you can see here how, in many respects, the intent of policy making is it's more complicated than just simply making foreign policy and then making sure it gets implemented. It has to be, in many cases, uh, interpreted the way that the policy making power would like it to be. And this is kind of a trial and error series of instances where uh, the the intent for a particular policy is not at all the realistic outcome of that policy once it's put into action. And in many cases, these policies begin to take on a life and aspects of their own, which quickly begins to get out of hand, even out of hand for these superpowers and within their particular spheres of influence. And that's always the case as far as trying to make sure that there's constant communication between certain blocks of interests to make sure that there are no surprises, as was happening time and time and time again during the middle years of the 1950s. Now, roughly about the same period of time, 1955, 1956, and onward, there was also, and your textbook does a good job of explaining and going into the details of this, there was also what was the creation of what was called the non-aligned movement, which was it was started in Bandung at the Bandung Conference, which is a city in what is today Indonesia. Oh, yeah, excuse me, yes. And it had it was a conference that was attended by some, I think it was close to 30 countries, all coming from, or largely coming from, the developing parts of the world, this kind of post-colonial portion of the world. Now, some attendees included the likes of China and India as well. So there was an effort here for some states that were maybe a higher, believed that they had a kind of more influence at these types of gatherings than they would either in the United Nations itself, or trying to make policy with the superpowers. Now, the non-aligned powers themselves were trying to establish a common cause as far as economic empowerment, putting in the policies necessary, or at least stating explicitly how economic empowerment was supposed to be achieved, what they were for as far as social advancement. But it wasn't really, because you're talking about a variety of ideological approaches here, a lot of variety as far as ideological orientation is concerned. There was no real ideological element to it. Of course, China was a communist state. Nasser was a nationalist, and so there might be instances where these kinds of approaches might coincide or intersect, but there was no real it was not a foregone conclusion where these ideologies would remain consistent, all kind of moving in the same direction in the same way to achieve an end. So, in that way, um, there was kind of a tug of war as far as how ideologically oriented these types of gatherings would be, such as in the case of the Bandung Conference. So, uh, but it is nonetheless a clear example of the independent orientation that these kinds of countries were going to carve out for themselves. And they specifically were non-aligned because they were not going to adhere to uh, strictly either following in the footsteps of the United States and the free world and liberal democracy, nor were they going to adhere to communist doctrine, kind of hook, line, and sinker. That they were going to maneuver between these two groups and any other powers or interests that they interacted with in order to secure their own particular notions of national interest. Okay. Another clear example of this, and probably the best example of this with regard to the United States itself, occurs with the long history that the United States has with the Vietnam conflict. This dates back to as early as the Truman administration, where U.S. advisors are beginning to try and establish a presence to advise particularly the French initially, because Vietnam was a French colony, but also to direct funds to the French so that they could pursue their particular colonial interests in Southeast Asia. So Vietnam was, as I mentioned, a French colony. Vietnam hoped to gain independence after World War II, as many of these countries did following that global war. France, however, as kind of alluded to on several occasions earlier, France wanted to maintain control of its empire, and from 1946 to 1954, war was waged between the French colonial forces and the nationalist-oriented Vietnamese forces. By the end of this conflict, by 1954, the United States was funding some 80% of the French war effort. So the French were the ones deploying the troops, and they were the ones deploying the hardware, but this was all purchased with U.S. money, or 80% of it. The U.S. aid for France totaled some $4 billion in aid, whereas the Soviets and the Chinese were extending aid to the nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh and his forces to the tune of some $400 million US dollars. Though better funded, the French forces were soundly defeated, utterly routed, at a key battle known as Dien Bien Phu. This was a massive, sprawling fortress that was surrounded and forced into surrender. And it surrendered to the Vietnamese forces. And that instance, that one key battle, ended up spelling the end for French colonial pursuits in Vietnam. At the Geneva conference that was between France and the Vietnamese, they agreed to what were known as the Geneva Agreements. This split Vietnam into north and south portions, communists under Ho Chi Minh controlled the north, whereas Western-backed Bao Dai and his administration governed in the south. Elections would be held in the year 1956. They were scheduled to take place in 1956, and under those elections, Vietnam was to be united into a single state. Now, Ho Chi Minh was the favorite to win these elections and become the leader of a united Vietnam. But Ho Chi Minh had been, had received a great deal of aid and support from the communist spheres of the world. I mean, his main backers were the USSR and China. Yet, nonetheless, he was kind of viewed as a George Washington type of figure within among the masses within Vietnam itself. In 1954, the United States backed South Vietnam and ended up replacing Bao Dai with more of a hardliner, a man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was a staunch anti-communist. He was also Catholic, and Diem ended up canceling the scheduled elections for 1956, and he declared South Vietnam a sovereign state. Eisenhower supported Diem and sent aid to Diem and his regime. That aid was continued under the succeeding administration, the succeeding Kennedy administration, elected to office and taking office in 1960. Another carryover policy between these two, between Eisenhower's administration and Kennedy's, was what happened in Cuba. On New Year's Day in 1959, Fidel Castro seized control of the country. This island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Initially, relations between the United States and Cuba were quite good. The U.S. businesses provided Castro's government with money. Vice President Nixon, vice president to Eisenhower, put his arm around Castro, saying, we're going to help this man. But quickly, Castro's policies began to run afoul of U.S. interests. And this particularly was with regard to land reforms that Castro called for. This began to step on the toes and infringe upon the interests of U.S. businesses and U.S. business owning property in Cuba. As a result of this, U.S.-Cuba relations fell out, and Cuba turned to the Soviets for aid and assistance. Eisenhower's response was to begin to formulate plans to invade Cuba and remove Castro. Now, those plans were organized and laid out, but they weren't carried out before the election in 1960 and Kennedy's taking office in 1961. So it was left to Kennedy to decide whether to pursue the plans that Eisenhower had put in place, or whether Kennedy was going to back off and not follow through. Kennedy is also going to inherit not only this problem in Cuba, but also problems in Vietnam, and how the United States was going to respond to future events there. This young President Kennedy, who had not very much international experience, he had served in World War II, but he himself did not have much foreign political experience. Kennedy was a big proponent of using covert military operations instead of large-scale offensive type of engagements. He was a big fan of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. And with regard to Cuba, Kennedy decides that he is going to move forward with the plans that Eisenhower had kind of organized. This operation ended in disaster. It was known as the Bay of Pigs, taking place in 1961, in which Cuban rebels that had fled Castro's regime fled to the United States. They would be trained, armed, and deployed back in Cuba in order to carry out a kind of a covert guerrilla war against Castro's forces on the island of Cuba itself. These Cuban rebels were killed or captured, and Kennedy was a complete debacle. And Kennedy took full responsibility and public responsibility. Just a year later, in 1962, the U.S. worries continued to persist over Cuba's communist regime and communist leanings. This was seen as a direct, not only an ideological threat, just 90 miles off the coast of the mainland United States, but it also infringed upon the long practiced and established Monroe Doctrine, that the United States was going to be the one to see to affairs of state within and throughout the Western Hemisphere, kind of a very paternalistic type of mentality. And here they have this renegade state just off the mainland that is not cooperating in the eyes of the U.S. government. Cuba feared continued U.S. interference, and so they continued to turn to the Soviet Union for aid and support. This included the shipment of Soviet nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles. 72 medium and intermediate range missiles were deployed on the island of Cuba. They were capable of striking nearly every part of the continental United States. In what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a tense 13-day standoff followed, where both countries sought to avoid nuclear Armageddon, essentially. This was, in many respects, the height of the Cold War, as far as a possible exchange, nuclear exchange, was concerned. It was successfully resolved. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for a U.S. pledge that they would not invade Cuba and that they would abandon plans to ever do so. And also the United States agreed to remove obsolete missiles that were currently deployed in Turkey that could have the potential to reach Russia's interior. Moving on the other side of the world to Vietnam, Kennedy, when he took office, initially backed Ngo Dinh Diem in 1961 when Kennedy took office, but by 1963 Kennedy agreed to support a military coup. Diem had become too paranoid and repressive, and this was alienating even members of of the citizens within South Vietnam itself. He was an extremely unpopular ruler. Diem was assassinated on November 1st of 1963, and on November 22nd of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now, by 1961, Eisenhower had originally sent some 785 U.S. troops to Vietnam, again in a capacity as advisors to the South Vietnamese government. By 1963, Kennedy had raised that number to some 16,700 troops. Within 5 years, by 1968, Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, would deploy in excess of 500,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam. This is the height of the Vietnamese conflict, the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, and the United States involvement in that conflict. The United States, through a majority of its carrying out this war, policymakers and powers that be in Washington considered this to be a war against the advancement of communism. It was in lockstep with this long established domino theory that you could not, which was a mutation, you might say, of the containment policy, where if communism was allowed to advance in one state, it would lead to this domino effect where neighboring states would begin to fall to communism as well. So therefore, it had to be stopped in each and every instance and manifestation worldwide. Well, that's a Cold War-oriented perspective. In the eyes of, say, Ho Chi Minh and other nationalist-oriented leaders around the world that were looking to establish their own sense of an independent state in their own fulfillment of their own interests, they were no longer interested in adhering to, again, a particular ideological perspective. They because Ho Chi Minh was willing to accept aid from the Chinese and communist and Russian or Soviet governments, he may have adhered to, or he may have seen some benefits to a communist type of perspective, but for all intents and purposes, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, not necessarily a communist. In fact, in 1945, after World War II, he looks to the United States for help in trying to win Vietnamese independence. Now, it just so happens he's at that time trying to win independence from the French, and so the United States had a decision to make whether they back France, its European ally that they're trying to rehabilitate following World War II, that they're trying to have become part of a key centerpiece in defending interests in Western Europe. So in that way, you can see the relationship here of just how the international community works in many respects. And through that experience, the United States really, in a sense of world history, really learned a pretty valuable lesson. And that was that it's one thing to have certain, to enter into conflict based on a sense of national interest, but it's another thing to understand the interests of the opposition and how they're viewing the conflict from their perspective. Ho Chi Minh had fought against the Japanese, and their imperial interests during World War II. Ho Chi Minh had fought against the French and their imperial interests, and trying to resurrect and reinstall their imperial interests following World War II. And now Ho Chi Minh was fighting against the United States and would fight against the United States up until the end of the war in 1973. In many respects, the lesson that the United States learned from this long, drawn-out conflict, which was the longest conflict in American history up until the war in Afghanistan and the war against terror in the 21st century, the lesson that kind of that time frame and the lessons learned in that experience were pretty. They were hard lessons to learn for the United States. It took a toll on at least two U.S. presidential administrations, one being Lyndon Baines Johnson's, the other being Richard M. Nixon's, who Nixon succeeded Johnson in 1968. For Johnson, he is trying not only to fight the Vietnam War, that's going to come to dictate and overshadow his entire all matters related to foreign affairs, but he's also at home trying to establish his great society. He's dealing with racial unrest and pursuing greater equality within American society itself, specifically for African American populations. Um, and so this is all becoming, it's all happening simultaneously. And some would argue that because of what happens in Vietnam, the Great Society and its agenda to providing a greater social safety net with things like Head Start program and Medicare and Medicaid and the pursuit of equal rights and civil rights. Uh, the war took its toll on those domestic programs. It sapped a tremendous amount of wealth from the United States as far as the allocating of funds, whether they go to foreign war or whether they go to these domestic programs. So, for Richard Nixon, he would win election in 1968. He would expand the war. He would try and Vietnamize the war. That is to say, he would basically push large sums of money towards the purchase of hardware so that the South Vietnamese could carry on the war effort, as there was a drawdown of American troops and a removal of American troops from the Vietnam conflict, trying to get the United States out. And because by this time, by the 1970s, U.S. public opinion had turned against the war. And so the at the peace table between U.S. delegates and Vietnamese delegates, there's an anecdote where there's in one of the more frustrating exchanges and moments of tension within the peacemaking process. There's a story where a U.S. delegate looks across the table and says to his counterpart, "Well, don't forget that we never lost a battle against you in this entire war." And after the translation, the Vietnamese delegate looks back across the table after a pause and says, "That's true, but that's also irrelevant," meaning that you can win every battle on the battlefield and still lose the war. And that's exactly what happened in Vietnam by 1973. It wasn't the U.S. were suing for peace, not the other way around, and Vietnam was going to get its independence. And 2 years later, by 1975, Vietnam would be consolidated under Ho Chi Minh's communist regime. Let me. It's we're getting on kind of on in time here with this lecture, so let me begin to wrap this up. These are just kind of a snapshot of examples of, again, what I'm trying to get at with this idea of identity. I mean, someone like Ho Chi Minh and the ability, the resilience of the Vietnamese people in order to take on adversary after adversary after adversary in order to achieve their aim of an autonomous identity it was not going to be denied. So, and you can see this time and time and time and time again. And so I think you've seen that across the scope of this entire course. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. Bringing it up as close as we can to the contemporary era, the 21st century. But even in our 21st century, I think you can get a sense of the complexities that is going to bring to something like world affairs, and also the forward progression of world history itself. Um, that there are going to be numerous perspectives, the proliferation of perspectives in many cases, and that it's not necessarily the vision of one over the other, but it's the collaboration, it's the interaction, is a more accurate word. The interaction between these perspectives that is going to be the focus. That there's going to be a need for greater compromise, perhaps between all parties, as the world itself begins to uh, grapple with existential matters, and which are in the news every day. Uh, this is from a world history perspective, this is a pretty intense turning point in the field of world history itself. That does humanity have the ability to do that, to be able to be responsive as much as possible to the variety of viewpoints, while at the same time having those perspectives be as kind of compromising as possible, so that you get a medium where parties have a vested interest in the success of a decision made, while at the same time it's the best decision for the group as a whole. Um, that is to be determined. It probably will always be something that is to be determined, but it is going to be up to every generation for them to decide if that's a viable option, and if so, how, when, where, why. That is going to play itself out. So that's world history in a nutshell here, going from 1450 to up to as much as the present day as we can. Apologize for the kind of broad brushstrokes here towards the end. I appreciate you putting up with these lectures, and I wish you all the best, and look forward to reading your final exams, and have a great holiday and New Year, and take care.